Hi, Ivana. Welcome to the session.
Hi, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you clearly. Thanks for
Perfect.
joining in. We'll be starting in a bit, maybe in around 10 minutes. So,
Yeah, that sounds great. I do have a presentation to share.
ah,
I don't know if I have to be co-host for that or if I can just share it like normal
that,
whenever we're ready.
that's okay. I'll be making you a co-host anyways.
Awesome.
Sure.
Thank you.
Adding on to that, do you have any links that need to be shared
If
or
I
any
have
of your
any,
social media handles? Just send it to me and I can share it throughout the session.
all right, thank you.
Welcome.
Hi, Madhu. Great to see you here. Thanks for joining in. Hey, hello everybody. Thanks for joining in. We will be beginning in the next few minutes. Just waiting for all our speakers to join in. Hi, Vicky. Thanks for joining in.
Hi, happy to be here.
I think everyone's here then. Yeah, everyone's here. Just waiting for our participants to join in from other sessions. Be a part. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our panelists for this open forum today. I'll be starting off with our first panelist, who is Ms. Ivana Ramirez. Ms. Ivana Ramirez is a gap year rising freshman at Yale University with the intention of pursuing a BA in global affairs and ethics, politics, and economics. She's particularly interested in journalism and data as they relate to policy in both international and domestic spheres. As a journalist, she has covered the roles that race, class, and gender play in the disparities of climate, housing, and criminal justice policy. Beyond these domestic issues, she has a growing interest in the role that the United States plays in the stabilization of countries in Latin America, Middle East, as well as the US-China relationship. She has received several awards and international recognition for her journalism from Samantha Power, the former spokesperson of the General Assembly, Brendan Varma, whom I've had the privilege of meeting, and also Emma Bowen Foundation. So please join me in welcoming Ivana to the floor. Ivana, please go ahead with your starting thoughts, and we'd love to hear what you have to say.
Good morning, everybody. It's so nice to see you all here from so many different countries and places. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Is that, oh, I see. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Will you see it? Can you see it now?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So like we were mentioning, my name is Ivana, and I've had the pleasure of interning with the United Nations Foundation, specifically with the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, where I worked a lot on addressing issues relating to data and the COVID-19 pandemic. So today I'd like to discuss with you all how data specifically plays a role, and especially how women are affected by the pandemic. So firstly, I'd like to take a look at the numbers overall, which I'm sure are statistics that many people are familiar with, but are nevertheless important to address. Firstly, the fact that women's jobs are 1.8% times more vulnerable compared to men's. 54% overall job losses were seen by women in the job market over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, and specifically the fact that 49% of those job losses were seen in the Americas and the Caribbean. And I think that all of this can really play a fact to questioning where we can see this happening. And that's where I think it's important to address that this is happening across the globe, in the Americas, in the Caribbean, Asia, and the Pacific, and many other regions across the world. We're seeing an equal amount of disparity between women and men when it comes to the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. And especially within the context of the United Nations, I think it's very important to look at the individual sustainable development goals to take a very close look as to how women are directly being affected. So you can see in these graphics here that when it comes to SDGs 1, 2, and 3, which is just to name a few examples, that women are disproportionately affected compared to men when it comes to the ways that COVID-19 has affected them. So for example, with SDG 1 and no poverty, 61% of women saw decreases in their savings, investments, and properties. With 2, 58% of women saw their food security decline in some sort of way. And with number 3, which is the goal of mental health, 66% of women saw their mental health declining compared to 58% of men. And this could come from a variety of issues relating to being sheltered in with domestic abuse partners and ultimately having to face the disparities of childcare, for example. But at the end of the day, it's important to note that women are more vulnerable to COVID-19 related economic effects because of existing gender inequalities. And a lot of that can stem from the fact that women are also disproportionately represented in COVID-19 affected industries. And I think the one that's making headlines the most right now is specifically the healthcare industry. You can look here in Spain, Italy, and the United States to the fact that women are not only disproportionately being affected, but also disproportionately represented in these industries. And while it's incredible that women are finally gaining the majority in an industry, it also means that it's important to take a closer look at the data to see ultimately how they are going to be affected. But I think before we can get into the conversation about data, it's important to define one key term, which is disaggregation. The idea that in order to examine data in a way that's holistic and really going to give us the entire picture of a situation, we need to break it down into detailed subcategories that can be by race, gender, sexuality, socioeconomic class, or any other defining factors that might indicate that people are being affected by different things in different ways in different places. So you can see here with the healthcare workers case in the United States in a more close-up view, that if we were to take away all of the data disaggregation related to men versus women, we would just see overall infections of healthcare workers in the United States. It's not until we take a closer look with the data disaggregation that we can see the fact that women are being disproportionately affected, which really points to how key data is in the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. I also think it's important to take a look at a different example of what can happen when data isn't disaggregated specifically by sex. So to this example, I'd like to point what happened with the United Nations creating a list of violent acts against women back in 2014. This was a summit that happened a few years ago in which several women representatives were invited to the United Nations in order to give their thoughts about what sorts of things should be included on a list of banned acts against women in order to protect them moving forward. The problem, however, is that the majority of people participating in this summit were from primarily European countries. So you can see from the official list, which ended up in the black, that people from European countries included things such as slapping a woman, throwing something at a woman, pushing or shoving a woman, whereas women from Bangladesh specifically, who were advocating for including things that happened disproportionately in their country compared to other countries, didn't make the list. So things like burning a woman, throwing acid on her, or dropping her from high places, things that were disproportionately happening to women in Bangladesh didn't end up making the list. And ultimately what we saw is that when the UN surveys were conducted as a whole, it revealed little about an entire subsection of women that were facing a completely different amount of violence that didn't fit Eurocentric guidelines, which is why data disaggregation is so important. So after all of these problems, you might be thinking, where is the solution? And there's actually a few concrete steps that we can take. Firstly, standardizing administrative data is an incredible pathway in order to make sure that we have all of the information possible about the people that are living in a country. For example, in many African countries, the records of birth and death aren't actually kept in a standardized way, which means there's no way for us to tell what percentage of women would be affected by COVID-19 in that population, since we have no way of telling how many women are actually there. Secondly, using citizen-generated data such as phone surveys, like the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development data did in Kenya, is a great way to get people on the ground continually looking at the status of their population in order to get a very accurate representation of what the data looks like while living it in real time. The third one I can get to in the next slide about centering data values is specific to the Global Partnership. But fourthly, like I mentioned in the earlier slide, it's important to recognize and even sit in panels like this to come to the conclusion and start every argument from the fact that even before the pandemic, gender inequality levels were still progressing at a way that wasn't going to be reached by the Sustainable Development Goals goal of 2030. And lastly, to work to combat gender inequality at the root level with policy that stems from the fact that women and men are inherently unequal in our society. And when it comes to the idea of centering data values, that's very specific to the ideas of the Global Partnership, which are working right now to create a set of data values in which all governments and non-governmental organizations can stem from the fact that it's important to disaggregate data and make sure that data is being used in a public way instead of a private way. So you can take a look at some of those principles here through the Inclusive Data Charter, which really stems from the fact that data is at the core of every single issue that we tackle. And when we take all of these steps together in order to center women at the problem of the COVID-19 pandemic, we can truly begin to make progress.
Thank you, Ivana, for that very inspiring and very insightful talk. Especially the use of data and that segregation is something you wouldn't really expect when you talk in an advocacy perspective. But now that you put it into perspective, it looks very clear how data is quite important here as well in an advocacy sense. And I work in data science, so this is very interesting to me personally. So thank you for that, and we'll be taking that forward as we go over to the panel discussion. So thank you for that. Now we'll be having our next panel speaker come up and share her thoughts. And please join me in welcoming Ms. Vicky Saunders, who joins us from Canada. Vicky is an entrepreneur, award-winning mentor, advisor to the next generation of change makers, and a leading advocate for entrepreneurship as a way of creating positive transformation in the world. Vicky is the founder of SheEO and Radical Generosity, a global initiative to radically transform how we support finance and celebrate female entrepreneurs. Vicky has co-founded and run ventures in Europe, Toronto, and Silicon Valley, and has taken a company public on the Toronto Stock Exchange. Vicky was recently named as one of 30 world-changing women in conscious business by Conscious Company magazine, and one of the 100 most influential leaders of 2015 from EBW, Empowering a Billion Women. In 2001, Vicky was selected as a global leader for tomorrow by the World Economic Forum. And with that brief introduction, please join me in welcoming Vicky to the floor. Vicky, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Good morning from Canada and afternoon and evening, depending on where you're coming from the world. So I just want to start by saying a little bit about my perspective in the world. So I think we're all very, very good at identifying problems. And we are at a moment in time where we need to be collectively imagining in solutions and a new world. And so I appreciate all of Ivana's comments around data. I think it's really important to understand the data. And as a change maker for the last 30 years, I know that data never changes anyone's perspective. This is one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot. For 30 years, we've had an unbelievable business case as to why it makes sense to invest in women entrepreneurs and invest in women. And the data at the moment is 2% of capital goes to 51% of the population, 2% globally. The numbers have not changed over the last 30 years. In fact, during COVID, they backslid dramatically. And so the business case and the data around that has not shifted behavior. So I want to just also put that lens out there. And then the piece that I think is interesting about the question, I just love this, like, has COVID exacerbated gender equality? And for me, the answer is yes and no. And I think we're living in this, we're very conditioned as humans to think in black and white. It's good or it's bad. The answer is yes or it's no. And we're living in so much more complexity than this. So I'm going to come at this with a bit of a different perspective, which is I think that COVID is accelerating the breakdown of our binary systems and our structural inequities so that we can transform what the world looks like and rethink what we value. And so, yes, you can create a case to show things are getting so much worse for women. And I'm going to kind of go to the flip side, which is 3 years ago, very few people were talking about root causes, as Ivana mentioned, the systems level challenges we're facing, the structural inequities that keep the numbers the same way. So this year, it's, the numbers are 257 years for women to get to pay equity. I mean, this is insane. These are completely crazy numbers. But I also think, like, you can lose all hope by sitting in those numbers and thinking, oh my God, it's never going to change. But we have to get much better, all of us, at noticing what is emerging. What is emerging that's showing us that transformation is coming, and how do we feel like we can be part of shifting that? So as we've seen lots of setbacks, there's lots of numbers out there. There's an 80% reduction in venture capital to women. I come from this sort of entrepreneur lens around this. And the fact that we're noticing that we're living in systems that were designed by a very, very small fraction of the population. And those systems are set up, and the game is very rigged for those people that are at the center of power and holding on to power. And those who are on the margins are unable to be able to shift the conditions for them because the game is rigged. All of the billionaires, there are more billionaires during COVID than ever before. They dramatically increased the amount of capital that they had on hand. And so for me, I'm seeing lots and lots of symbols out there and lots of emergent trends around us waking up to the fact that we have to shift our systems. Our inequality is off the charts. All of our business models actually create more inequality. We do not have one financing mechanism, not one mode of financing that doesn't create more inequality. What do we do with that? There are 5 people on the planet right now that have more than half the wealth. So the approach that we've taken, the mindset that we have of winner takes all, go win the market, is over. The whole way that we're structured is massively unequal, and it can't change unless we step back and go, we have enough for everybody. There's enough food on the planet for everyone. We just haven't evenly distributed it. Same thing with money. There's enough for everyone. And so from my perspective and from all the work that we're seeing, we fund women entrepreneurs who are working on the Sustainable Development Goals. And we've done this with thousands of women around the world and expanded this model to many countries. We're seeing that the recognition of the structural inequities that exist in our systems is the beginning of the unraveling of what we've got and the chance for us to collectively imagine in a new future. So for the young ones who are here looking at these numbers and thinking there's no hope, there is so much hope. What we can collectively imagine in for a different world is the possibility. So I come at this from, I think that COVID has actually accelerated the demise of the existing systems, and the shift towards more equitable systems is on its way. Thank you.
Thank you, Vicky, for that very fresh perspective. I think it's an interesting way to look at it, that the pandemic has actually demolished the current systems in a way, or is accelerating that demolition. I'd like to take that discussion further when we start off to the panel. But before that, I'd like to welcome our third panelist. And please join me in welcoming Ms. Madhu Krishna. Madhu Krishna joins us from India. She leads the Foundation's India Initiative on Water, Sanitation and Hygiene, and manages a large portfolio at both national ministries and 5 focus states with over 40 implementing partners. She also oversees the work of the Foundation, working with various community structures, self-help groups, farmer producer organizations, etc., that cover close to 40 million women and more than 1 million farmers. She brings with her a diversity of experience in a wide range of fields, including private, public, and non-profit sector work. She has been a development professional for over 25 years with a special focus on program design, evaluation, policy, and advocacy across various initiatives, including sanitation, public health, which includes vaccines, maternal and child health, agriculture, poverty and livelihood, and women's empowerment. She also brings expertise in strengthening development organizations in project management, strategy development, and creating and utilizing networks to align and work towards common goals. She's deeply interested in gender and social economic equity. She has a master's in social sciences from the University of Delhi. And with that introduction, please help me in welcoming Madhu to the floor. Madhu, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Jaideep. And thank you for making my job quite easy. So I'm going to talk about both issues. And Vicky and Ivana, thank you again for your really interesting and fresh perspectives. So as both of them have said, gender inequality and inequity is ubiquitous. You can see it everywhere. was pre-pandemic, post-pandemic. It's in the world of politics, public health, economics, society at large. And we, of course, sometimes see it in our own homes, in our classrooms, and our everyday experiences, whether we're at the marketplace or while looking for safe transport. It's not a new problem. In fact, it's, I think, one of the world's oldest, layered in ancient cultures, convoluted histories, and deeply embedded social norms. But in 2021, as my co-chair, Melinda Gates, reminds us, we cannot use the complexity of resolving gender inequality as an excuse for failing to think and act more intentionally about putting in women and girls at the center of what we do. So at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we still claim to be learners. We are kind of late entrants in it, but we are very purposeful in that our gender equality division sits at the heart of everything that we do at the Gates Foundation. So we actually last year set up a separate division with a new president, and I actually represent the division in the India office. So prior to the pandemic, issues of this declining rate of female labor force participation, at least in India, gender pay gaps, unequal access to digital solutions, uncertain social security, and little to none financial protection, along with an enormously skewed childcare burden, were just some of the everyday realities for the majority of the women that we are trying to help in India and around the world. Both big industries, governments, and social sectors continue to be predominantly led by men, as Vicky also told us, in the financial sector as well, leaving out more than 50% of the population's voice and understanding of their social, cultural, and biological needs. So I'm really sad to report that as the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic continues to be felt, closing the gender gap, as Vicky says, seems to have increased by a whole generation, from 99.5 years to 135.6 years. And as Vicky said, those are very daunting numbers if I'm talking to this audience. And again, all of these inequities that we saw before have only been exacerbated, with more women who make up a majority of the informal sector, especially in our country, being pushed out of work. Generation of young girls, again in our region, pushed out of schools and therefore into early marriages. And whatever little progress we'd made, because they didn't even have access to digital tools, they're now really out of school as well, and an increasingly growing care burden. And of course, the biggest pandemic that we are seeing, at least in India and our part of the world, is a rampant increase in domestic violence against women, with families locked down at home and both economic and social circumstances pretty dire, with very frequent lockdowns. So the women are facing the brunt of having to navigate this deeply patriarchal family and societal structures in our country, with a very stressed economy that is struggling to produce new jobs and opportunities for them. We have a whole list of numbers, but I'll give you some. Indian women spend on average more than 5 hours per day on unpaid domestic and caregiving work. And you'd ask, what are the men doing? They're spending 30 to 40 minutes that's all, in a day, on the same amount of unpaid domestic and caregiving work. So you can imagine the huge disparity that women are facing. And then, of course, they have no opportunity to actually do something, quote unquote, called gainfully employed. 92% of women between 15 to 59 years participate in unpaid domestic activities daily, versus only 29% of men. So there is also no major difference, astonishingly, in the surveys that we did last year and this year, in these numbers between rural and urban geographies. So it's not as if urban women are better off than any rural women in India. Actually, the same amount of time is spent by both. And while the Indian economy is touted to be the 5th largest world economy in 2019, India still ranks 112 in the Global Gender Gap Index. So none of those opportunities, unfortunately, have actually filtered down to women. And 94% of women are either self-employed and work as daily wage agricultural laborers or at construction sites, or as self-employed micro entrepreneurs or engaged in home-based production. Because of the pandemic, 75% of those jobs were also lost in the informal sector, where 94% of the women work. So, and in 2018, we found, and this is pre-pandemic, that 63% of women in India held themselves back from top managerial work, owing to the pressure of the unpaid labor that they were asked to do. And self-employed women earn only about 30 to 40% of the income earned by self-employed men. So while the world celebrates the digital revolution, the last statistic that I'm going to throw out, that while 63% of women in India have access to a mobile phone, and most often it's not their own personal one, 79% of men actually own a phone in their own name. And when it comes to mobile internet, 42% of Indian men have access, but only 21% of women do. And that also very infrequently and completely controlled by the men in the household. Their access, what they see, who they talk to on the internet. So these statistics, as Vicky said, can seem very overwhelming and are important to understand. So I completely agree with Ivana that we need the data, but we shouldn't let ourselves feel so overwhelmed. We also have to reiterate that it's not all doom and gloom. And it's definitely not too late for women to start seeing much better equity coming their way. So several government initiatives, again, I'm going to reiterate something that my panelists did say, that the pandemic, since it showed such an exaggerated inequity for women and men, and women, despite all the challenges, actually stood up in the pandemic, both as healthcare workers, as Ivana has shown around the world, but also as community volunteers. And really the safe circle of women who actually stood up to give communications, provide relief, had focused the government on initiatives on reducing drudgery for women today. So even before the pandemic, we saw a lot of extension of gas connection schemes that alleviated the burden for women to go out and collect firewood and make food, as well as the huge network of piped water. So those were two things that rural women really suffered from. And as COVID flared up, it was the self-help group women in India. They are now about 78 million women under, organized in self-help groups in one of the world's largest platforms of what is called the National Rural Livelihood Mission today. And the amount of investment that continues to be put into that by the government is quite mind-boggling. So today we have both an opportunity and a vested interest in fighting for gender equality and equity. When women work, economies grow. It is estimated that women could potentially contribute an additional $13 trillion to the global economy by 2030, and that's not very far away. Also, in India alone, if we formally recognize women's unpaid care work, it could contribute to another $1 billion to the GDP. So this would be something that we need to do, both for the economy, but also on a very high model ground. So a few pointers on the way that we can look at the way forward. I believe collecting gender disaggregated data is very important. And I'll give you a very live example that happened. We support the vaccine program in India as part of our technical support to the government of India. We also support many other health programs. And one of the things that struck me is that data, as Ivana showed, on vaccinations was not being reported by gender. It was just being reported as a national rollout. And by simply asking the question, how many women have been vaccinated, of all the numbers that you're showing, we discovered that there was actually a 17 to 19% gap in the amount of vaccines that were being given versus men. And by simply asking that question, the government took note and sent out a memo to all the states to start tracking all the vaccine data, because the vaccine data was available. Nobody was tracking it. So it wasn't even that they didn't have it. They weren't asking the questions, they weren't tracking it. And the minute we started asking this question, the central government started sending out the same question to every state. And today we're happy to report that many states have reduced that burden to that gap to almost 5%. So the gap reduced very significantly by simply having the data and then asking the question. So having the data is not enough. You also have to have people look at their data and ask the questions. And often that is the next point. The second one that I believe, and I think Ivana and Vicky both talked about, is bolstering the childcare economy. And that really goes to the next generation, right? If we had real significant strides made by both the private and public sector to enhance the childcare economy, that is to provide safe childcare for all families, then we would see a double win. because women would be able to safely participate in the workforce because childcare does fall on them. And then secondly, you'd also create an opportunity for them to actually run those childcare centers, right? So, and then they would get an economic opportunity, which they don't get. So this is a very important way forward to reduce the gap in gender economic opportunities. The third thing that we have to worry about is how can we really look at equity rather than equality. And by that, I mean, you have to look at what are the kind of work preferences that women like to do. And what are those dictated by? They're dictated by gender norms, they're dictated by patriarchal biases, which don't allow women to move far. So in order to have a much more equitable, we need to find ways to reduce these barriers. So if women need as I said, childcare, if they need safe transportation, if they need assurance of mobility, safety in their workplace, if you provide that, you provide one of the most important ways in which you can reduce the gender gap. And the third, and of course, the message for the young generation is we need to understand that a lot of domestic work in childcare is not necessarily something women are more geared to do, are better able to do. All of us can do it. It's just that it's easier that, oh, mom's going to make food, or the sister can go and look after the laundry, and I am supposed to do things that are outside, and this is all women's work. And that's not something that men often talk about. And the third thing I want to say is that this is not a gender battle. It's not a women versus men. It's a societal issue. It's something that, and men suffer from it too, because if they do it, they're told, oh, you're a much weaker sex because you're doing quote unquote women's work and not family work and not productive work. So first of all, we need to tag that actually all of this work is actually productive, economic work, and that each of us has a responsibility to carry it so that we have a healthy, equitable society in the future. So ultimately, gender equity cannot be an afterthought for you or for the next generation after you, or a good to have. It will have to be the deciding factor for the future of our societies, economies, and for the health of our nations all over the world. Thank you.
Madhu, that was indeed very interesting because of the statistics you mentioned and how you could use those statistics to actually cause change. That's one very interesting thing. The second very interesting thing I found in your talk was how you mentioned that during the pandemic, women stepped up and they actually were at the forefront. And I think one very important point, which I'd like to bring also, is we also should keep in mind that the top 5 countries who handled the pandemic were led by women. And that's another very interesting point, that women just need the opportunity. And that's where the equity element comes in, regardless of whether it's economic, social, or any other kind of factor in play. It's just the equity we're talking about just relates to the opportunity. I think that's a very recurring theme all 3 of you talked about. And that's something we will want to take up in our panel discussion as well. So thank you everyone for your initial thoughts. And I can see some questions coming in as well. So that's absolutely great. Let's start off with our guiding questions before we start off with the panel questions from the participants. So I'll start off with our first guiding question for the day. And the first question I have for all of you is, what challenges do you think has the pandemic enhanced in regards to the 5th Sustainable Development Goal? So this is a very broad question, and I think you've all touched up on this a bit here and there. But then if we go into a bit of the specifics, let's just try to see if there's anything additional we can talk about. So maybe we can start off with Ivana. So Ivana, you want to go ahead?
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you everybody for your incredible thoughts. I think it's very clear to see how data can be both incredibly dismal and also incredibly hopeful in the fight against COVID-19, which is why I think this question is such an important one to ask, specifically looking at which challenges COVID-19 is really enhancing, especially for women during the pandemic. And I think we all touched on this a little bit, and Vicky made some good points about this in the chat, but I think especially the issue of things relating to the home have really made the pandemic especially difficult for women. So whether it be the fact that women who were in lockdown during quarantine had to stay with domestically violent partners against their will, or the fact that students were sent home, which meant that a lot of women had to stay home as well, taking care of their children. It's things related to that which ultimately put a lot of the burden on women because of what Madhu mentioned about society as a whole not accepting the fact that there are family roles instead of roles that are simply made for women, ultimately made the brunt of the pandemic shouldered on women.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point there. So maybe we can take it up to Vicky now. Vicky, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many interesting things here. Again, I'm going to just keep playing the role of flipping it to the other side, like the possibilities that it started to open up. So prior to the pandemic, most like what work looked like versus what work looks like now has really transformed, and we've witnessed this, imagination. We could never imagine before how people could work at home, and how that would happen, and how we would be able to collaborate. And so there's deep inequality built into this as well. As Ivana said, those who don't have space at home, who have children that they're, that are at school age around them, it just makes work almost impossible. How are you dealing with children that need to be, you're a teacher now while you're doing your job, while you're dealing with a lot of the household activities, which is just impossible, truly. Like, there's so many women that we're in conversation with who are just at a breaking point, can't do this anymore. So there's just been a massive exodus from the non-flexible workplace. And so that's a very interesting sort of trend happening, which on the sort of entrepreneur side where I live, sees a lot of interesting new business models coming up around flex work. I can work 2 days, or I can work on my own terms when I need to. It's starting to redefine what work might look like. So shifting our perspective around what the workplace is like, I think is quite an interesting evolution that's coming out of this. We'll see what that looks like. But it's when we seem to be in this like almost incarceration of there's only one way to do anything in the world. We're very stuck in like, this is the way. And I think COVID is kind of unraveling a little bit the story of that. And so we've now seen kind of impossible things happen. Oh, wow. The economy kind of kept going for some folks, but we've also seen that people noticing how unequal it is. Those who are on frontline workers, how completely unequal it is. If you've got the privilege of being able to order groceries to your house, life actually maybe was better for you in some ways. And those who are actually delivering on the front line have had it much worse. So there's this constant sort of like both and. It's not just one thing that's happened. And I think this keeping our mind open to the complexity of these systems and how they're really not serving humans is one of the things that we've seen.
Yeah, some great points there again. Madhu, any final comments?
Yeah, I think, again, great points, as you said. For us, I think the most severe, as I said it by statistics, was the real pushing out of women, who 94% of them were in India working on as part of the informal sector. So the lockdown impacted them hugely. They weren't able to go out. Markets were closed. If you were a street vendor, if you were a vegetable vendor, if you were running a micro enterprise, you had no income for 3 years. For 3 months at least in the first wave. And then of course the second wave hit us again, you lost lives. And alongside that informal work was also the fact that they were often out of the social benefits, social protection. So there was actually a huge loss of income. And with that, a huge loss of social empowerment. So the way we look at women's economic empowerment is that it's two sides of the same coin. If you are a money earner, then you have a little bit more status in society, in your home. And because they weren't earning and because they weren't able to be out of the house, then they were also subject to a lot of both domestic violence, but also domestic jeer, and also a huge amount of hardship. Those that did go out obviously did it at the risk of their own life and limb, because of course COVID hit everyone so badly, especially in the second wave. So the economic impact on women was huge. The good side, as I also want to say, is that we also saw that women somehow managed to navigate digital solutions. So, they were getting messages on their phone and actually reaching out to their neighbors, whether they were looking at their kids' phone or forcing their husbands to, or their partners to share their phone. We were able to train. So in 1.5 months, we trained 100,000 women on COVID appropriate behaviors that they took to their communities. So that has opened up a huge opportunity for us to say, how can we give them better business skills? Can we tell them better farming techniques? So is there a way, as Vicky says, to reimagine how you can actually build up skills and get better economic opportunities? Can women actually work on e-commerce platforms? Can we group them as micro entrepreneurs and get them better inputs and have better linkages to market? Because it seems like their runway to understanding digital tools is actually much shorter than we thought. So it is an opportunity for us to build back better, we say it, as long as we do it with several flexible working models. Not all have to be digital. Can we think of offline methods that use digital tools to help women? So mobile radios, community radios, can they then be adapted as well? So figure that out, because women's appetite to learn is obviously huge, and their ability to upscale themselves is also huge. But they did feel the COVID impact on women's economic ability was huge. So and many women have told us that they eat 1 meal a day since the pandemic broke. So it's actually quite distressing.
Yes, absolutely. Some very important points there. Economic ability is being hindered, but I think the fact that you mentioned that the digital tools got more popularized, that kind of brings me back to Vicky's point when she mentioned that it's also become a means to accelerate existing issues and taking us out of those issues. And that's maybe a start, but then again, there are trade-offs to that, and that's not something we wanted. That's definitely a very good point made. Thank you everyone for your thoughts. So now we'll be moving on to some questions from our participants. So how I like to do this generally is I call out the name of the person, and then they unmute themselves and ask the question. That way the engagement is much more. So how about we start off with Inaya, who joins us from Kuwait. Inaya, do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself? If you want to switch on your video, feel free to do that as well and ask your question.
Hi, yes. My question is that when Ivana was speaking and everyone was speaking, they involved the topic of data and how data is being used, numbers and everything. Data is important, again, data is essential, but nowadays in my country, Kuwait, I'm basically born in India, so the most of it, news and everything is used from India. I see news of India. And the data that they show in the media is never the truth. It's adulterated in one or the other ways. So I'm just a 14-year-old, not a big student or something, to make some changes out there. But even being a newly being teenager, what can I do to prevent this showing of how women are the source of the problem, and how to make the media prove that even men are as much as liable to the hassle as women are shown and are conveyed by the media. I want to know what insight can I give by even showing them that even a kid can see how the media is changing the information and making men the victim and showing women are manipulated.
Thank you, Naya, for that question. So pretty much a fake news element there. So let's start off with maybe Vicky this time. Vicky.
I love this question. Thank you so much, Naya. So first of all, I just wish we weren't living in a place where we're conditioned to say things like, I'm just 14. You thankfully have a chance to reimagine what you're seeing out there, and you are born in this age of digital tools. One of the things that we're seeing so much of is really innovative use of the new technologies. I don't know if you're on TikTok or some of these new platforms, but using humor and sharing your stories of how you see things that are not what people are presenting data, and then you can show the reality of that really simply in these side-by-side screens. or using your ability, like the fact that you see that already is amazing. So congratulations and thank you for that, and that you're on this call. That you're ready to lead now. You don't need to wait until you have 2 PhDs. Please don't wait that long, because then you'll be conditioned in the way that you're supposed to not say all those things out loud. But I think using these tools and sharing your voice in the world to the degree that it's safe for you to do that in the communities that you're in, I think is the big gift that we have. It's, you know, in my generation, we didn't have all these tools to connect with each other and share these stories globally. And that to me is just a massive difference that is going to accelerate the change that we need to see. So thank you.
Jaideep, can I give an example to Inaya of how a little girl changed education policy using the same tools that Vicky did? So I know you talked about fake news and how girls are seen as being perpetrators, but a small 6-year-old girl who was obviously being tutored at home using digital, I think she was in kindergarten or maybe, and wrote a letter, a full public letter to the Prime Minister saying, I'm 6 years old, this is my school, and this is the amount of work I have to do as a 6-year-old. And I have to read all these lessons and do all this homework, and I get no time to play. So even though I'm not allowed to go outside, sometimes I like to go for a walk, etc. So she wrote a really nice, heartfelt letter to the Prime Minister. Someone picked it up. It was a public letter, and I think somebody helped her put it on social media, and actually caught the imagination of the entire nation, including policymakers. The Prime Minister asked all state education ministers to look into why 6-year-olds were being asked to do so much homework, and why wasn't there enough time, etc. And the curricula was changed. So exactly to Vicky's point, you never know what your small action, because the world is so linked and connected, can lead to actually a huge, huge change. I mean, we have so many great teenage heroes. We have Greta, we have so many other girls, we have Malala, we have so many girls who've actually made a deep impact. And so I too, along with Vicky, would encourage you and most of the men and women in this room to actually raise their voice to issues that they feel. You don't know the power that you already have. And thanks to social media, there is a huge, huge impact that you can have. And if all of us just say, we don't believe this news, we also have the power to actually fact check the news and make sure that we understand and everyone understands that this fake news isn't getting them anywhere.
Thank you, Madhu, for those inputs. Let's conclude with Ivana. Ivana, what do you have to say to this?
Thank you so much for this question, Inaya. And I'm so glad that at such a young age, you're already considering the impact of data and news on the world around you. I'd like to give you some concrete places where you can start to get involved. So if you're interested in writing at all and you think that there's something that you can pursue with investigating what you're seeing on the news, I encourage you to start writing articles about what you're reading and how that maybe is very disparate from what's actually happening as you're seeing the data start to form in front of you. Some other really great organizations for you to get involved with are Girl Up, which is an organization of the United Nations. They do a lot of great work involving data and women and are open to very, very young girls like you. And also the United Nations Association is another youth-centered organization branch of the UN, where you can, if you're feeling a little bit lost on where to start or how to begin dismantling this incredible system, you can have a lot of very concrete avenues, which will be great places to get involved.
Thank you so much, each one of you. These points are amazing, and I've started to feel that inspiration coming up to work towards what I've been planning. So yes, thank you.
Thank you, Naya, for the question. Thank you, everyone, for those wonderful inputs. Some very interesting conversation there. And yeah, fact checking of information, regardless of where it's coming from, that's very crucial. I think in today's time, regardless of where you're living, that's something everyone should be doing. Now let's move on to another question, maybe from Maria, who joins us from Ukraine. So Maria, do you want to go ahead, unmute yourself, maybe switch on your camera, ask a question?
Yes, thank you. I'm unable to switch on my camera, but I would like to ask a question. So how can a high school student like myself. So I just want to contribute somehow, in some way, not just to the media, but overall, I think I would be interested maybe in writing articles or making videos like Vicky mentioned on TikTok about the issues. So what exactly does a teenager have to do to get involved? As Ivana mentioned, the CDGs and the disproportionate effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on the CDGs and on the gender inequalities that the world has to face. So what can a teenager do to work in some way up in the CDG world and improve the situation? Thank you.
Maybe let's start with Madhu.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks, Maria, for that great question. Again, coming as one of the biggest powers we've seen for women to make an impact is the collectivization of women. A single person has a huge amount of impact, like I just illustrated, but also in the long term, you need to create strong collectives. So even as a high schooler, you could start a whole group, whether it's a social media group or your own group, to talk about what the impact of gender inequity you see, what you've researched, what are some of the solutions you've seen, and actually start a collective to start talking about that. So the power of the collective is very, very, very strong. And you will realize that even where you are, that there are probably girls who face some kind of inequity in their own life, in your own peer group, who will benefit from coming together because they'll have the power of the collective, they'll have people who can find them support, who can counsel them out of it. And then you can use your collective voice to advocate for whatever issue that you feel is important for either your own peer group or for girls you want to help. So I'm a big, big believer in the power of women's collectives. We call them women's empowerment collectives. I think for young girls, it's an even more powerful, because often there is information sharing that is kept very restrictive for girls, right? And you're told about some things and some things you're not told about. People don't know, about menstrual health maybe, or sexual and reproductive health. And those are very basic information so that you know when you step into those areas, how to navigate the world. And I think there's a lot of information that girls are not given openly, girls and boys too, for that matter. So I actually believe that the power of the collective is very important. And you will find that in your peer group, you can find it in a social media group, and you will find your voice will get further amplified. And choose one or two issues that you're really passionate about, because we can't boil the ocean, as we say. So find a couple of issues that you really want to work on, and then build a collective around that. And then, of course, definitely write your articles, and you will find the amplification will happen because of your group effort. So that's one suggestion I have.
Thank you, Madhu, for that suggestion. Maybe let's go to Ivana now.
Thank you. Maria, this question is very personal to me because I myself am still a teenager for a few more years. So I found a lot of the frustration that you're having with really making an impact and getting involved at a very early age. So I encourage you to look into the organizations that I've mentioned. For example, this past year, I worked with UNA USA to work with Michelle Bachelet, the UN Human Rights Coordinator, to develop a human rights report surrounding police brutality in the United States, or pitch outlets that are directed to teenagers, like Teen Vogue, for example. I wrote an article for Teen Vogue about environmental racism, and people at Yale have recognized me from the internet because of that article. So you can be very surprised to find that the places where you insert yourself can actually get a lot of amplification for the issues that you're really passionate about. And I encourage you to take a lot of initiative about that. And I think you'll find that you can create a lot more change than you expect.
Great. And Vicky.
Yeah, it's, yes, what they said. Honestly, this is just the moment. This is why you're here. You're noticing these things. You're on panels like this. You're connected with all of us. Get engaged. Pick your thing And, you know, when I was getting started, I cared about so many things. I remember talking to a mentor and I said, I just don't know where to begin. There's so many things that make me crazy about the world that I'd like to be part of. And my friend just said to me, make a list of all the things that you're interested in and just get started. And then go, you know, try something. And if it doesn't work for you, go to the next thing. This is a process of like figuring out where you can have the greatest impact with the gifts that you've been given. And I think just to go to what Madhu said, it's very, very important now to get into collectives together to find the others. It's very difficult to do things by yourself. And so your ability to create a collective influence and bring people together around issues you care about, that's the work that we're here to do. So good luck with it. And I sent you my email if you want to reach out.
All right, great. Great. Thank you for that question and thank you for those answers. Now, there are no more questions here, and I think the guiding questions are pretty much something we covered, but I have an interesting question. So we've been talking about inequality, inequity in gender. Now, what can the role be from the male side? What is the role that the man has to play to run this forward? And I feel it's something which is less talked about because they think it's women empowerment, but the thing is the man has to step back and reflect on what he's done wrong to make the situation like this. So maybe let's start off with Vicky on that. So Vicky, what do you think that the male side has to do?
Yeah, I think you said it right there. Step back, pass the mic, listen. And, you know, part of this whole thing is, you know, there's like so much data around this, but if men just step back and maybe ask questions about experiences instead of leading and taking up the oxygen in the room, which is what happens over and over and over, because we're sort of conditioned to do that. It's not that men are doing things bad. It's, you know, this is conditioning that society has created that we need to shift. And so I think if there's a moment to pass the mic, just like there's a moment for white women to pass the mic onto Black, Indigenous women of color. There's a centering of whiteness and there's a centering of patriarchy in the world that must shift. And so I think it's paying attention to that. And on that note, I will pass the mic.
Maybe Madhu can go next.
Thanks, Jaideep. I actually think we are not going to make headway in gender equity unless men become completely a part of the movement. I feel like when we do speak, they think, oh, this is a woman's issue and I don't have much to contribute. So there are two ways. One is absolutely pass the mic, enable your women colleagues, your fellow students, listen, encourage every one of your own peers of yours gender to listen, to be empathetic, to stand up and actually talk about the issue of gender equity. Because as a new generation, you need to be completely intolerant of any inequity, whether it's racial, whether it is gender. And it's, as I said, all of us have to do it. And we have to be able to take some of the bashing that I'm sure men will get, right? We've seen that. I mean, the whole case, the most horrific case that ever happened of this girl who was so violently raped in India, but her partner was equally beaten up because he tried to defend her, right? And we get scared when we do that. So we go back into places that are comfortable. Fighting inequity is not comfortable. It's not going to ever be comfortable, whether it is just speaking up. And if there's 2 women colleagues and there are 11 men in a boardroom, 10 men will not speak. And if there's one person who's speaking and is brave enough to need to hear from my female colleague, he later will be told off that, oh, you know, you don't have to sound so, you know, whatever, supportive. But I think it's time for all men to be brave and to speak up, just like it takes time for people like Vicky who are born white, not because they want to exercise white imperialism, but to speak about it, right? And to be told that, oh, fine, this is a position you want to take, etc. So I think it is power structures. I think men are equally victims of the kind of conditioning that we're told, you shouldn't wear pink, that's a girl's color. You shouldn't do domestic work because that's women's work, right? So if you do that. Or we've heard of men who help women in the house will be told, oh, you just do this because you want to please your woman, but that's a thing. In India, we see that all the time, right? That you're just the slave of your wife, etc., etc. So I think men have to be quite brave, have to understand, because how are you going to pull a world when 50% of women don't have opportunities, when 50% of work, when the economy is not going to move beyond a certain proportion, and you're going to leave 50% around? How are you going to solve the world's biggest problems, whether it's climate change or it's poverty or it's agriculture? How are you going to solve them if 50% people are way behind the line, right? All of us have to run this race together. And if, again, as the COVID pandemic has shown, I actually feel quite sad sometimes that, we've all gone back. It should be planet Earth fighting this COVID pandemic, but it seems like we've all gone into our own corners, and extreme nationalism has come further into play rather than receding and saying, this is a planet Earth. Virus is not seeing any boundaries. It's not saying, oh, this is the US, so I'm not going to enter here, I need a visa. It's going to enter, and it's going to enter the UK, and it's not going to stop. But we don't have that global sort of perspective. And I think in gender as well, it has to be the entire human race. It's not women's job to fight for gender equity. And we won't win unless we have all our male compatriots as our colleagues in this fight.
Definitely agree with that point there. Very well said, Madhu. And Ivana, what about you?
I tend to think that the last point that Madhu just made about the fact that we're not going to win or make progress without male companionship and support really speaks to a prerequisite that I think exists for the collaboration of all genders when it comes to supporting female equality. And I tend to think that as an unfortunate consequence of the patriarchal society that we live in, sometimes we do need men to pave the way initially in order to get women into rooms where they can then begin to take the stage and take leadership. So ultimately, I think that men should feel comfortable with inserting themselves into spaces as long as it is with the ultimate end goal of then stepping back and allowing women to continue in leadership.
Absolutely. Some very well points there. Thank you so much for those pointers there. So then let's talk about one broader question here, and that is women's representation in politics. So that is something which has been talked about a lot, but we have not made a lot of progress in especially some countries in Asia. And I'd like to know some perspectives there. And why do you think that could be the case? And why this sort of fundamentalist ideology that politics is a male profession is deep rooted, and how it can be changed? So maybe let's start off with Madhu here. So Madhu.
Yeah, it's again a good question. Actually, India has had very strong women prime ministers. That has not translated into very women leadership across the board, and especially in the political field. It is seen. I often say women are made because they're in such a minority in any of these leadership positions, whether it is business or in politics. The number of women per men are so small that somehow they have to lose their feminist or feminine equality agenda in order to be acceptable, right? So they don't want to be seen as the only person in the room who's talking about equality because I'm 1 in 50 or 1 in 375. That's what. Where we have made progress in terms of political representation is through affirmative action. So the 50% representation at the Gram Panchayat level, which is the village council level at local self-government, there we have made progress over the last 30 years. It started out very patriarchal in the sense that, okay, it's my wife, so the panchayat leader's wife, because there was a quota and they had to have women who were panchayat leaders, or panchayat is the village council leaders. It would often be the wife or the sister or a sister-in-law of the local leader. But eventually over time, as more and more women got into the system at that level, we saw a transition of power. We saw much more women's voice. Again, the numbers are very important. right? So 1 woman versus 50 men, not going to happen. Her voice will be drowned off. 25 women, 50 men, much louder voices and can talk about their agendas. So we need to have a quota system. The way why it's not succeeding in our main parliament is because it's constituency. So they reserve constituencies, not just the absolute number of seats. And that's where men are shy of conceding power. So we have to find a much more amenable way in which we can induct women. It does need affirmative action, absolutely will need it. How that quota system is designed should be that it doesn't threaten men that your constituency is going to be taken away from you. So they reserve constituencies. They don't reserve, X number of women. So every party, for instance, should be asked to say that you should have at least 50% women in your candidates. And then you will have a much more equitable. Then it's much more equitable because everybody fights elections. Every party has 50% women candidates, 50% men candidates. So I think the formula for affirmative action is the way that it was presented in Parliament has made it far more unlikely that men will give up. But if we have a better formula and we can all press for that formula, and there's some of that conversation starting to happen in India, we should see some success. As I said, the village councils are where we've already seen success with this kind of thing. And the way that it went in is that 50% of women in the council have to be women. So, your 50% leaders have to be women. And so it's not on your constituency. Everyone has to follow that rule. So I think there is much more scope to do it that way.
In fact, that reminds me of my high school political science class where we were studying about women's representation in politics. And I come from the Indian curriculum. So basically what I remember studying is there's a women's reservation bill in the parliament. It's been there since 2005. It has still not passed. And it's simply because they don't have the will. And that's something where Madhu's point comes in. It's because the bill has been presented in a way that's a threat to men. And it's sort of because of the patriarchal nature of the polity, but then again, it's a problem that has occurred. Now, this is a very Asian perspective we've talked about, and I'd like to get more of what the Americas have grown in terms of women politics. So maybe we can get some insights from Vicky next.
Well, I was thrilled that Madhu went immediately to the solution, which I love. Quotas, and 100% behind that. I think we've seen a real shift over the past decade, I would say, where before a lot of women in power or those who are influencers didn't want to see quotas, but we're really starting to see a shift in that direction because the numbers just keep getting worse. I think there's this phrase that I think about a lot when trying to create change in this way, which is when you're used to privilege, equality feels like oppression. And this is the challenge we have to deal with the psyche of those who have been used to being in power. And there's this thing where prove to me, women, why you should be here versus asking men to prove why 85% of the positions are held by you. Why is that happening? And then it creates this conflict, which is not what you want, right? You want to be able to co-create where you're going. And so we've seen a really big challenge. We have an election going on right now in Canada where some of the most powerful and impactful, strong women candidates are not running anymore because it is so toxic. Social media has just made it absolutely impossible to run and have a life and actually really feel safe. It's just not a safe environment anymore. There's a small group of people who went after our environment minister, who was very really wanted to be activist around climate change. And they vandalized her local political office. She's just had so much taunting coming towards her that she ended up leaving and feels like she can have more of an impact around the climate file outside of the political organizations and the structures that we have in place. So we're seeing more and more trends around this, and there have been panels and panels in Canada around, even with a feminist prime minister. We have a lot of challenges in our own culture pushing back on women leading. So there quite a bit of backsliding on that piece, and it comes back to the sort of structures and the conditioning and this need to really rethink what kind of societies we want to create, because the one that we've got right now isn't going to get us to the equity that we need. I'll pass it to
Definitely
you,
agree
Madhu.
with that. Definitely agree with that. I think it's coming down to a point Madhu made as well, that we had a very strong women prime minister, and we still haven't been able to have a strong woman polity, and that is a key problem, which is not just in Asia, but in some elements in America and other parts of the world as well. And how about Ivana? Ivana, do you think you could give us some insights from Latin America as well?
Yeah, I was actually just writing an article about this with regards to Japan, actually, in which all of the male politicians were having side conversations in which they explicitly said that they didn't want women being involved in those conversations about legislation, even though women were openly and seemingly involved in the government, which I think really speaks to the importance of very disaggregated and clean data when it comes to the involvement of women in political spheres. Like you mentioned about the fact that the top 5 countries in response to the pandemic were led by women, especially in New Zealand. And I think that that data is incredibly important and helpful in really moving forward the progression of women when it comes to politics. In my home country of the Dominican Republic, female politicians aren't really seen all that much. But I think that when it comes to promoting that data and really making sure that it's widespread, we can see a very big difference if we were to use the information that we have.
Definitely agree. And then the data element comes back into the picture. So that's very interesting how everything's interlinked. And it's great to hear all of you in those different perspectives. In fact, I was talking to a friend before this panel discussion, and they were asking me who the panelists were. And I said, it's these 3 women. And he said, who's the 4th one? And I said, we don't have a 4th one. He said, the 4th one should have been a man working in this field. And this kind of shows that there is probably a lack of men working in this field. And that is kind of very sad. And that comes back to the point you all mentioned, that more men need to be involved in the conversation, and they need to be actively engaged and willing to recognize that they need to step back and give way for women. And that's not happening. And it is happening gradually, but it's too slow a pace. Anyway, so we have just about 5 minutes left. And I'd love to take any closing comments from all of you on this discussion we've had, and what the youth here who are from either high school, some of them are from middle school, a couple of them are from university, what you think are the steps they should be taking, the things they should be taking away from this discussion so as to grow and maybe take this forward into their own communities. Maybe let's start off with Vicky. Sorry, Ivana. Ivana, go ahead.
Thank you, everybody. And like I mentioned, this conversation is very personal to me as a young person. So I encourage you all to please, please look into the organizations that I mentioned, because they really are incredible spaces to get involved in, especially if you're looking to impact change either in your local community or in your country as a whole. And I think that just by being here, listening to this conversation and engaging with what my colleagues have brought up too, you're already taking very important steps in order to create very impactful change in your communities.
Thanks, Ivana. It was great to have you. Vicky, how about you next?
Yeah, I'm really focused on imagination these days. I think we need you. We need you. We need your fresh ideas so desperately before you get too educated and conditioned into the way that we do things. We have to rethink a lot of parts of society, how we act together, what kind of world we want to create, what are the conditions around that. And so I would really encourage those who feel called to it to start imagining what the new institutions of the future look like, rather than joining the ones that we've got, because we got lots of challenges with those too. So for the more entrepreneurial ones out there, we need your new fresh ideas. So please bring it.
Definitely, definitely. And finally, Madhu.
Thank you. I have similar. I think we gave you great ideas. Ivana has told you to look at data very carefully. Ask questions. As I said, asking innocent questions can have a huge effect. Build collectives around causes that you believe in. And I'm going to say, have an intolerance for inequity of any kind. Don't let the kind of fractured inequities that we are seeing, don't be please tolerant of them. Be intolerant as a youth. Ask for a better from your leaders, from us, from your parents, from your society, from your peers. Please be intolerant of inequities. Even start a collective if you want. And gender is at the first one. And the second word I want to leave you with, inequality is also intersectional. If you are a Black, Hispanic, Indian, Asian woman of a particular caste, your inequity and your experience of the world is much more different. So there's a basic inequity, and then there is a further intersectionality of that inequity. And all of those need new institutions. I would, say absolutely to Vicky's point, the institutions of the past are not working for us. Like I said, this COVID pandemic, it's not easy to get countries to collaborate, right? So imagine your own institutions, create them. Don't wait for someone. Exactly. Again, I want to echo Vicky. She said, don't wait for 2 PhDs. I'm saying, don't wait for your master's or for your high school. Work now, because by the time you come there, you will already have these institutions further entrenched if you don't. And there are sections in your own peer group that are actually making institutions that are worse than what we have today. So make sure that you start now building that big citadel and fortress. Intolerance of inequity, I think, is a very, very important one in every sphere of your life.
And with that wonderful speech, I'd like to conclude this open forum. Thank you to everyone who's joined in, to all 3 of our panelists, to all of our participants for your questions and for your engagement. And it's been lovely moderating this. This will be the last forum I'm moderating. So thank you for joining in. It's been a pleasure to have you all. It's been a pleasure to listen to you as someone from the male community myself, and someone who will take this away, this lesson, to step back and let more females moderate such sessions in the future. So thank you very much.
I give one suggestion to you, Jaideep, and to your whole group. You should have many more plenary sessions that are on gender inequity. To me, it always gets into the third and last day. So my encouragement is gender inequity should be a plenary session for the next generation until you see that you fixed it.
Okay, that's a good point. And Ananya, I think our Secretary General is in the room and she will take cognizance of this. So yeah, Ananya, we should have more plenaries on gender inequity. And yeah, that's a point well taken. And she said she agrees with you in the chat. So thank you, Madhu, for that suggestion. And thank you everyone for being a part of this panel. Ananya, do you have anything to say, or can we conclude?
Yeah, I think just before we leave, I think, like, I cannot thank you enough to all of our incredible panelists for being here today. As a woman and as somebody who's always been very passionate about gender issues, it's always so important to hear from women in the field talking about their experiences and talking about what they see. And it's so important that we make sure that future generations have that same kind of passion. So truly, thank you so much for being here. And thank you for everything that you've covered. I think I speak on behalf of everyone when I say that, it has been so incredibly inspirational and just so amazing. So yes, thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to our incredible panelists once again. For everybody who is attending, our plenary session will be starting soon. But yes, this was absolutely incredible. And I'm completely in awe of all of you. So yes, thank you so much again, and have a wonderful evening, rest of your day, or whatever it is. Yep.
Thank you to the 3 of you. And I think we've added your social medias to the chat, so then participants can connect if they wish to. Thank you very much. And thank you to all my participants. Have a wonderful summit ahead, and I'll see you all later. There's another open forum coming up on our MUN programs. Thank you so much.
Thank you.